welcome. My name is Cole. Today's video features the very first performance of a Schubert sonata on this channel. Perhaps typically for me, I've decided to go for one of the most rarely heard among the Schubert sonatas. If you like this channel, do consider making a donation, becoming a patron on patreon.com. That's at www.patreon.com/independentpianist. Or if you would like to, you can also make a donation through PayPal. Any kind of donation does help me to keep this channel going, so I do appreciate that very much. Schubert is kind of a remarkable character among the well-known composers from the past, inasmuch as he has so many incomplete works that are extant. Not only that, but actually works that are central to his popularity. So just think of a piece like his Unfinished Symphony, which of course has only 2 out of probably what was intended to be a 4-movement piece completed. And it's generally played that way, with only 2 movements, to great effect, and is a beloved piece in the repertoire. Well, there's actually a lot of pieces like that in the Schubert catalog, and as I mentioned before in an earlier video, it's a little difficult sometimes to number Schubert's works, but among his piano sonatas, I personally think that the most reasonable count would be 20 separate piano sonatas. And out of those works, 7 of them either have incomplete movements, so movements where the music cuts off before the end, or they're in a similar situation to the Unfinished Symphony with missing movements. And surprisingly, many of them are actually quite effective in performance. This tendency to have incomplete pieces, though, has lended credence over the years to the idea that Schubert was not a very disciplined composer, that he would just kind of give up in the middle of his works, etc. And actually, I think that's not the case. What is really true, though, is that Schubert wasn't very careful about destroying incomplete sketches for pieces that he ended up not following through to completion. So to contrast, someone like Johannes Brahms, for instance, who was very obsessed with his legacy, was very careful to destroy his youthful compositions that were not published, or other sketches that he didn't end up using, things that he thought were not worthy of his legacy. But Schubert was not like that. He was not so self-aware in that regard. And it's lucky for us, really, that he didn't destroy these things, because some of these works, like the piece that I'm playing today, are among his masterworks. This F-sharp minor sonata is one of the pieces that has all the movements extant. It was evidently projected to be a 4-movement sonata. However, the first and last movements are incomplete. However, the fact that these movements are incomplete really shouldn't disturb us too much, because they are both sonata form movements, and they cut off right before the recapitulation. So that point in the music where the music from the beginning of the piece repeats, but transposed into the home key. And this is very common among those works that Schubert did leave incomplete. It's possible to kind of reconstruct Schubert's working method from this. Probably for him, writing out the recapitulation was just a mechanical task, so he just left it for the last thing to do. And if he didn't feel convinced enough by the piece as a whole, he didn't even bother finishing that. However, this does make our job easier if we want to actually complete the piece and perform it ourselves. I do think I suspect why it was that he wasn't convinced by this piece. And that's probably just because it was a little bit uneven in quality. So the first movement is simply one of the greatest things Schubert ever wrote. It's absolutely inspired and moves me to the depths of my being. It really looks forward to some of the later great sonatas from right before his death, like the B-flat sonata, the great G major sonata. It has this kind of expansive, magical quality to it. The second movement is also very lovely and tender. But the third movement, which is a lively kind of scherzo and trio in D major, I find to be somewhat disappointing. Certainly, it's a contrast, and it's a good enough piece, but it doesn't seem to match the kind of rarefied atmosphere and intensity and beauty of the first 2 movements. So perhaps Schubert also felt that and was unconvinced by it. It's hard to tell. When I play the sonata, I take the rather unconventional approach of substituting a different piece for the scherzo and trio. So there's a very lovely C-sharp minor minuet, Deutsche 600, and a trio in E major, Deutsche 610. And these are just individual movements that are floating around. They were written probably around the same time as the sonata, but we don't know what Schubert wrote them for. They've never been successfully linked to any of his other large-scale works. but I think that they perfectly fit within the spirit of this work and continue the magical atmosphere already established by the first two movements. And the last movement is quite striking and interesting, although perhaps not quite the same kind of a level as the first movement. I think it's still a very convincing and effective piece, especially if the completion that you have is very, very good. And for these pieces, on the rare occasions when they get performed, oftentimes pianists don't complete the music. They just break off at the moment where Schubert stopped writing. That can be dramatic and effective in its own way, but to me it kind of seems like a shame, especially since it's a fairly simple business for a musician of any caliber to complete the recap based on the exposition material. You just have to transpose the music into the right key. The only real leap into the dark is to figure out the coda, of course, because there's no indication necessarily what Schubert would have done for a short coda. And of these two particular movements from the F-sharp minor sonata, there have been several completions, and there are some that have been very good, very sober and appropriate, like there's the ending that Paul Badrowskoda made for the Henley Urtext edition. That's a great, well-written little ending. I've also heard some that have been quite bizarre, in fact, and I think that they go against Schubert's intentions. I won't mention which ones those are, but you can probably guess if you've put any effort into researching this stuff. Well, the completion that I'm playing today is the one that was thought up by the forte pianist Malcolm Bilson. And as far as I'm concerned, it blows every other attempt out of the water. He does some quite interesting things in the recap to make a little bit of variety, the sort of thing that a composer like Schubert probably would have done, just to make it a little bit different than the first time. But nothing too extraordinary. But what he does for the coda of each movement, particularly the first movement, is absolutely inspired. The height of taste and sophistication, really. And to me, I'm not mystical, but it almost feels as though Bilson were channeling Schubert when he wrote these passages. It so convincingly brings to mind Schubert's style. I also make a few very small changes of my own, but nothing of much note. I mark the changes that I make. And I put a link in the description, too, for a video where you can check out Bilson's recording as well. He records it on a forte piano contemporary to Schubert's time. It's well worth listening to. Bilson's a very interesting musician. He always does fascinating things. So please enjoy the first movement. I'll be posting the rest of the sonata soon over the course of the next couple of weeks. And thank you very much for watching.